Continued, page number 204. Walter Scott, 1771 to 1832. We have already called attention to two significant movements of the 18th century, which we must for a moment recall if we are to appreciate Scott, not simply as a delightful teller of tales, but as a tremendous force in modern literature. The first is the triumph of romantic poetry in Wordsworth and Coleridge. The second is the success of our first English novelists and the popularization of literature by taking it from the control of a few patrons and critics and putting it into the hands of the people as one of the forces which mold our modern life. Scott is an epitome of both these movements. The poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge was read by a select few, but Scott's Marmion and his Lady of the Lake aroused a whole nation to enthusiasm, and for the first time romantic poetry became really popular. So also the novel had been content to paint men and women of the present until the wonderful series of Waverley novels appeared, when suddenly, by the magic of this wizard of the north, all history seemed changed. The past, which had hitherto appeared as a dreary region of dead heroes, became alive again and filled with the multitude of men and women who had the surprising charm of reality. It is of small consequence that Scott's poetry and prose are both faulty, that his poems are read chiefly for the story rather than for their poetic excellence, and that much of the evident crudity and barbarism of the Middle Ages is ignored or forgotten in Scott's writings. By their vigour, their freshness, their rapid action, and their breezy, out-of-door atmosphere, Scott's novels attracted thousands of readers who else had known nothing of the delights of literature. He is therefore the greatest known factor in establishing and in popularizing that romantic element in prose and poetry which has been for 100 years the chief characteristic of our literature. End of page 204. Now page 205. Works of Scott. Scott's work is of a kind which the critic gladly passes over, leaving each reader to his own joyous and uninstructed opinion. From a literary viewpoint, the works are faulty enough if one is looking for faults, but it is well to remember that they were intended to give delight and that they rarely fail of their object. When one has read the stirring Marmion or the more enduring Lady of the Lake, felt the heroism of the Crusaders in the Talisman, the picturesqueness of chivalry in Ivanhoe, the nobleness of soul of a Scotch peasant girl in the heart of Midlothian, and the quality of Scotch faith in old mortality, then his own opinion of Scott's genius will be of more value than all the criticisms that have ever been written. At the outset, we must confess frankly that Scott's poetry is not artistic in the highest sense, and that it lacks the deep, imaginative, and suggestive qualities which make a poem the noblest and more enduring work of humanity. We read it now not for the poetic excellence, but for its absorbing story interest. Even so, it serves an admirable purpose. Marmion and the Lady of the Lake which are often the first long poems read by the beginner in literature, almost invariably lead to a deeper interest in the subject, and many readers owe to these poems an introduction to the delights of poetry. They are an excellent beginning, therefore, for young readers, since they are almost certain to hold the attention and to lead indirectly to an interest in other and better poems. Aside from this, Scott's poetry is marked by vigor and youthful abandon. Its interest lies in its Aside from this, Scott's poetry is marked by vigor and youthful abandon. Its interest lies in its vivid pictures, its heroic characters, and especially in its rapid action and succession of adventures, which hold and delight us still, as they held and delighted the first wondering readers. And one finds here and there terse descriptions or snatches of song and ballad like the Boat Song and Lochinvar, which are among the best known in our literature. In his novels, Scott plainly wrote too rapidly and too much. While a genius of the first magnitude, the definition of genius as the infinite capacity for taking pains hardly belongs to him. For details of life and history, for fine-drawn characters, and for tracing the logical consequences of human action, he has usually no inclination. He sketches a character roughly, plunges him into the midst of stirring incidents, and the action of the story carries us on breathlessly to the end. So his stories are largely adventure stories at the best, and it is this element of adventure and glorious action rather than the study of character which makes Scott a perennial favorite of the young. The same element of excitement is what causes mature readers to turn from Scott to better novelists who have more power to delineate human character and to create or discover a romantic interest in the incidents of everyday life rather than in stirring adventure. Notwithstanding these limitations, it is well, especially in these days when we hear that Scott is outgrown, to emphasize four noteworthy things that he accomplished. First, he created the historical novel, and all novelists of the last century who draw upon history for their characters and events are followers of Scott and acknowledge his mastery. Number two, his novels are on a vast scale, covering a very large range of action, and are concerned with public rather than with private interests. So, with the exception of The Bride of Lammermoor, the love story in his novels is generally pale and feeble, but the strife and passions of big parties are magnificently portrayed. A glance over even the titles of his novels shows how the heroic tide of history for over 600 years finds expression in his pages, and all the parties of these centuries, and all the parties of these 6 centuries, Crusaders, Covenanters, Cavaliers, Roundheads, Papists, Jews, Gypsies, rebels, start into life again, and fight or give a reason for the faith that is in them. No other novelist in England, and only Balzac in France, approaches Scott in the scope of his narrative. Number 3. Scott was the first novelist in any language to make the scene an essential element in the action. He knew Scotland and loved it, and there is hardly an event in any of his Scottish novels in which we do not breathe the very atmosphere of the place and feel the presence of its moors and mountains. The place, moreover, is usually so well chosen and described that the action seems almost to be the result of natural environment. Perhaps the most striking illustrations of this harmony between scene and incident is found in Old Mortality, where Morton approaches the cave of the old Covenanter, and where the spiritual terror inspired by the fanatic struggle with imaginary fiends is paralleled by the physical terror of a gulf and a roaring flood spanned by a slippery tree trunk. End of page 205, now page 206. The second illustration of the same harmony of scene and incident is found in the meeting of the arms and ideals of East and West, when the two champions fight in the burning desert and then eat bread together in the cool shade of the oasis, as described in the opening chapters of The Talisman. A third illustration is found in that fascinating love scene where Ivanhoe lies wounded, raging at his helplessness, while the gentle Rebecca alternatively hides and reveals her love as she describes the terrific assault on the castle which goes on beneath her window. His thoughts are all on the fight, hers on the man she loves, and both are natural, and both are exactly what we expect under the circumstances. These are but striking examples of the fact that in all his work, Scott tries to preserve perfect harmony between the scene and the action. Number 4. Scott's chief claim to greatness lies in the fact that he was the first novelist to recreate the past, that he changed our whole conception of history by making it to be not a record of dry facts but a stage on which living men and women played their parts. Carlyle's criticism is here most pertinent. These historical novels have taught this truth, unknown to writers of history, that the bygone ages of the world were actually filled by living men, not by protocols, state papers, controversies, and abstractions of men. Not only the pages of history, but all the hills and the vales of his beloved Scotland are filled with living characters, lords and ladies, soldiers, pirates, gypsies, preachers, school teachers, clansmen, bailiffs, and dependents. All Scotland is here before our eyes in the reality of life itself. It is astonishing with his great number of characters that Scott never repeats himself. Naturally, he is most at home in Scotland and with humble people. Scott's own romantic interest in feudalism caused him to make his lords altogether too lordly. His aristocratic maidens are usually bloodless, conventional, exasperating creatures who talk like books and pose like figures in an empty tapestry. But when he describes characters like Jean Deans in the heart of Midlothian and the old clansman Ivan Dhu in Waverley, We know the very soul of Scotch manhood and manhood. Scotch manhood and manhood. Perhaps one thing more should be said, or rather repeated, of Scott's enduring work. He is always sane, wholesome, manly, inspiring. We know the essential nobility of human life better, and we are better men and women ourselves because of what he has written. George Gordon, Lord Byron, 1788 to 1824. There are two distinct sides to Byron and his poetry, one good and the other bad, and those who write about him generally describe one side or the other in superlatives. Thus, one critic speaks of his splendid and imperishable excellence of sincerity and strength. Another of his gaudy charlatanry, blare of brass, and big bow-wowishness. As both critics are fundamentally right, we shall not here attempt to reconcile the differences which arise from viewing one side of a man's nature and the poetry to the exclusion of the other. Before his exile from England in 1816, the general impression made by Byron is that of a man who seeks an irregular life, posing as a romantic hero, makes himself out much worse than he really is, and takes delight in shocking not only the conventions but the ideals of English society. His poetry of his first period is generally though not always, shallow and insincere in thought, and declamatory or bombastic in expression. After the exile and his meeting with Shelley in Italy, we note a gradual improvement due partly to Shelley's influence and partly to his own mature thought and experience. We have the impression now of a disillusioned man who recognizes his true character, and who, though cynical and pessimistic, is at least honest in his unhappy outlook on society. His poetry of this period is generally less shallow and rhetorical, and though he may still parades his feelings in public, he often surprises us by being manly and sincere. Thus, in the third canto of Childe Harold, written just after his exile, he says, "In my youth's summer I did sing of one, the wandering outlaw of his own dark mind," and as we read on to the end of the splendid fourth canto, with its poetic feeling for nature and its stirring rhythm that grips and holds the reader like martial music, we lay down the book and with profound regret that this gifted man should have devoted so much of his talent to describing trivial or unwholesome images and posing as the hero of his own verses. The real tragedy of Byron's voice is that he died just as he was beginning to find himself. End of page 206. Now page 207.